Hey everybody, so it's Memorial Day, finally had some time, so I wanted to put together a quick tutorial on Wwise and Unity and how we're using it with Lucky's Tale. So this is kind of how you could set it up for any bigger project and how it works on a fundamental level, setting the switches, setting the states, controlling transitions, and I wanted to cover it for anyone else doing a game with Unity and Wwise to show how you set up the music. So this is just music with those things in mind. So without further ado, let's begin. So here we are in Wwise, and we'll go into the interactive music layout. First things you'll see, we have a regular music hierarchy which holds everything. Most important thing is this switch container. So this switch container uses states, and it's the default switch container that is the play and stop for every single track of music. There's only one play action. It's when you open the game and run it, and it runs this Wwise play event, which plays this main container. Now what that then actually plays that's audible is all dependent on the transport control and what states have been set. So you hit play, and then the game determines what plays. And the stop is when the game ends. So those are the two events that always control the play and the stop. And then how things react afterwards is controlled just with states during gameplay. So you never stop, you never have two plays. There's only one play. When the game starts, states occur, change the music, transitions happen. Game ends, you stop. That's the best way to set things up with Wwise, is with this kind of a switch container. So the main music play goes to that switch container. As you can see, it uses a music mode state container, and those exist in the game syncs states tab, so you have to make these things. The reason we have a main and a time trial is each level can be in one of two states. You can enter a level and have it be normal gameplay, or you can enter a level and it's a special type of mode called time trial, where we want a unique music track for each level in those instances. That way, on a fundamental level, if you go into a level or a scene in Unity and it's a time trial one, it'll ignore all our normal music and instead play whatever it says in time trial for that particular level. It's a good way to override on a fundamental level for your scenes which music is playing. And that's, again, you can see it's at the base level. So when it goes from main to time trial, it'll ignore everything in the main container and just do what's ever in time trial. So we set the music main if we're in a normal game mode. So this is like normal operating procedure. You've triggered the play, which plays the music mode. The state has been set in Unity that says music main, meaning game's playing normally. And then you have to set which state containers are controlling the actual music in the game. And so the other state container with all our switches is called music subswitch. And this is a list of every stinger, every different track, every level, every scene, every possible thing that can happen in game will be covered by here eventually. This is what we have so far. So you create this, and every time you add a new scene in Unity, you have to add it here. Every time you add a new little moment in the game that needs to change on states, you have to add it here. So this is what holds all of that. Then you go to your, let me kill that, that's going to get annoying. Then you go to the actual mapping of it, and here you can see the music switch container. You basically, if this wasn't here, you select it and you add paths, and then it looks like this. And this is where you map what happens when this switch goes to this state. So you can see right here that if we went to the boot scene, it plays the boot scene. And in the boot scene playlist is a music segment that loops infinitely, and that'll be this, looping infinitely. Now, apparently I don't have the original file. I don't know why. I thought we had them all, but irrelevant. That's what will happen. It will say, okay, we've switched from main mode into boot scene, and it will play. And I guess I can show that right now with the transport control. Nothing will happen yet until I hit boot scene. And I might have to kill original because it looks like I don't have the actual file for the boot scene. So instead, we'll go to one that I know works. So let's say, hey, we went to the Golem Awaken. Oh, why isn't that playing? Oh, because I played the boot scene. So this is an easy mistake to make, duh. When you're auditioning your changes, you have to hit play from the transport control and just... See, I had the container selected instead of the transport control. Things you miss when you're doing a tutorial not actually working. So to be safe, I'm going to do this from Soundcaster instead. So right now we're at a default state. The game hasn't been run. Nothing's playing. Music play. Which won't play anything. Why? Because again, it's playing the root of the switch container, which doesn't have any state set, meaning it won't play anything. If I hit main mode, still nothing will happen. Now, if I go to Subswitch and set it to a level, in theory, we should still hit boot scene. But if we can't, because I don't have the original track, we should definitely hear this. And we do. So this is how you can set up nested containers. And you can do it even deeper, on a deeper level. Well, each level or scene gets its own sub switch. So it'd be music main and then a whole nother container for each level. That way you can kind of nest it a little more logically instead of having 500 different things in one big container, switch container here. You could have sub switch containers for each level and then hold these things in those instead of all in this one. But this is how it is for now for our demo. So how that works is all transitions are held in this transitions tab. So this plays, this goes to this. When we change that sub switch to part 1, it plays, go figure, whatever I've assigned to part 1. And to assign that, you have to click and drag it in, just like that, which I won't do because it's already done. So you have to assign all of these, click and drag them in one by one, even if they're named the same, kind of annoying. Then how you control the other things like transitions and stingers, we'll go into that right now. I should leave that Soundcaster up because that's going to be handy in a second. So this is the main transitions tab. Now this will hold all possible transitions between everything. The ones on the bottom are the most important and will override everything else at the top. So for an example, I'll show you this any to Wildweed to part 2 track. So when you are in the game, you start at part 1 and then you go into part 2 and then you can go into this little wildweed battle where you fight some wildweeds and then you go out of the wildweed battle back into the part 2 music. So it's part 1, part 2, wildweed, back to part 2. How you control those transitions is in the transitions tab. So this will happen immediately because the wildweed battle is an immediate thing. I wanted it to fade out the music that was playing by the time it hits the transition. And that works because on the transition segment, which is intro drums 1, I have a pre-roll of a beat, and it's actually about half a measure. So for half a measure, it does a little lead in, and then on the beat it lands with the hit, and it transitions into the new music. So this will happen immediately. It'll play this little intro, and then on the beat, it will transition to the new music. Now that works, and again, if I hit backspace in this, it will go backwards through the things I've been looking at, which is really handy to cycle around because this viewport kind of sucks. So if we go back to the transition, going into the wild weed. It will exit immediately. It will fade out prior to the downbeat. That works because I have the pre-roll that I just showed in the transition track. So it'll exit, it'll play this. During this pre-roll, it'll fade out, it'll play that, and on the beat, see how it says pre-entry and post-exit? That means it'll play before and after those markers I just showed you. Then it will go to the entry cue, meaning the beginning of the wild weed battle. And the wild weed battle track is here. And it's a looping track that just, that's not it. How did that happen? That's the wild weed battle track. So we wanted to lead into it, and we wanted to outro out of it by going into the transitions tab. And when you're going out of it back to part 2, I wanted to wait until the next grid, and the grid's set on each individual track, which is a half note because, like I said, these transitions work better on a half note, just the way the track is written. So it'll follow that grid, it'll wait for the half note, and then it will exit. No fade out, no anything. It will use a transition segment. Now this transition segment, I believe, was a similar process where, there you go. So you have the intro and the outro. Same thing. They could have been the same, but I wanted the possibility to change them out later. So now, when you go from the wild weed battle into part 2, it's going to play that transition segment, pre-entry and post-exit. So it'll give you a half a bar, which is the same as the grid. And on the half a bar, it'll play the transition segment. And on the beat that it exits, this will stop. This will play whatever was after that exit cue, is just a tail of a drum hit. And it will jump to a random custom cue of a specified playlist item called replay. So why would I do this? Instead of going to the beginning of the track, which was better as an intro into the level, I wanted to jump in at a part that made more sense, a more loopable, more organic section of the track. So it doesn't sound like it's just starting all the way over and lose momentum. It sounds more like you're just re-entering gameplay. And I'll show that right here. So that's the Awaken Gates Open 05107. Awaken Gates Open. And I believe that was in first play, right? Yep, that's first play. So if you go in here, hey, look at that. What's that? That's a custom cue. So by naming it, you can right click up here, add custom cue. Also, I believe shift click will add a custom cue and add it where you want to play the music. So instead of playing it from here, which doesn't really make sense, that's the intro, that's the You're Welcome to the World track. I'm playing it from there with a little fade in, and that's a more natural back to the energy of the regular level instead of, hey, we're starting over. So to show that, now that you've seen that custom cue, this will probably make more sense. We're going from the Wild Weed battle, playing the transition segment that I showed earlier, and on the beat, we're going to transition to the random custom cue that matches the name replay, and we're going to fade in like that. So that creates a fade in at that point, which gives you a full bar of entry back into the regular music. So let's hear all this in action with the 1, the 2, and the Golem Awaken. And we can do that in Soundcaster instead of having to do it in the world. I will show Unity in a bit, but for now I just wanted to show this. So here we go, music play, nothing, main. We'll hear the music as soon as I click part 1. Fantastic. Nice, beautiful music. Okay, and then you go through the doors, things happen in the game, and we're ready for part 2, where the energy picks up. Now that could be smoother. Other things happen. The doors open and sound effects kind of glue over that in the game, so it's not as noticeable. So this plays and it goes into this playlist. And then you hit the wild weeds. Now the wild weeds are a quick battle that happens right away. So we do that instant transition and we play the transition cue, and that's what this sounds like. And let's say you beat the wild weeds, and that can really happen at any time. So we'll go back to part 2, because that's what we designed it in the game. I'm going to do it at a weird part of the beat. So there you can see it quickly faded out, played the end of the drums, went back to that custom cue and played from there instead of from the beginning of the track. All working wonderfully. So that really demonstrates the basics of how we've set up quite a few things for the main gameplay music. What else you have to consider is transitions and stingers. They generally live outside of this main switch container, so I just put them in folders. You could put them in a music switch container to control the global levels of them all, but I've put them all to a bus. I'll talk about the bus structure in a minute. So, what other cool tricks was I doing in gameplay that I should talk about before I talk about stingers? There was a pretty cool thing I did with a looping track that I should probably talk about. So this file is actually the same as the other file. I have one main track. This is the first play. So it's got this intro and it's smooth, but it wouldn't loop well because the beginning doesn't have a good tail to loop at. And it'd be weird to loop at that point without the tail of the other track playing. So instead I have a looping track, which sounds a little weird there, but it's very smooth, I assure you, in the context of an actual loop. Now what's cool about this is that wasn't an explicit loop that I bounced separately. I just looped the main part of the track twice in my main bounce. So it's all one long file with the meat of the track duplicated. And so what happens there is, at that point, you're going to get that tail from the previous playthrough of the track. Which sounds very smooth in context. So that has the tail of the end of the meat of the track playing into the beginning of the meat of the track, which means it's a perfect looping point. So instead of having to create this as a separate bounce, instead of having to make a whole different file, I'm saving the file space on the disk by just making a copy of it, putting it in here, doing the edit in Wwise, and letting that be the loop point. So I duplicated it in the DAW, bounced it as one big longer file, pulled it in here, and that's my loop point. Then in the playlist, we have the first play with that smooth beginning that doesn't loop, that plays through normally, and then it leads into the loop track that has that tail in the beginning that loops infinitely. So that's a great way to set up the first playthrough and the looping playthrough. And then you can use things like custom cues and syncing directly to the custom cue to control not always playing from the beginning, and instead playing from very designated points of the track that make more sense as you jump around between dynamic game music moments. Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay. Before we continue, I want to make sure it's still okay. Everything seems good there. So let's go into stingers and transitions. These need to live separately from the track because you call them in that weird transition matrix. And why everything lives this way, boy, I would like it to be improved, but it doesn't. So the order of things goes source, transition lives on top of it, and then destination. And the transition can either add time or be right on the beat depending on how much time you give the transition. It can add time in between the transitions or not. So they have to be separate because you call them from this little parameter here and define them. And they're just segments. They can be playlists as I recall, but I just leave them as segments with randomize containers. If you haven't set up a random step, you right click here or you click here, change your track type from normal to random step. This will play one of these three things each time it's called. Never did that, so I had to hit F to force it. Apparently randomize is actually randomized. Never played the third one. So this is where I let all my stingers sit. You can see I route them to the stinger ducker. I'll talk about bussing in a second. And those are both the same length, so I lined up the exit to be here. So when we call these, they play for half a bar. They add that time in between the two tracks, which will bridge a gap. And if I ever call it as a non-stinger, and I call it as more of a transition, it would add half a bar. So randomized cues are really helpful. Sequence step, if you want them to be in order each time, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Stingers are pretty easy. You know, you just pull in your files. Tempo can be used. If you really trigger them as a stinger, you're going to have to set them up in the game syncs. Oh, are they in the share sets? I always forget where those things are. I thought they were in here. Triggers? Where are the triggers? Where are the triggers? Triggers. I'm just going to make a new one and we'll call it. So you set up real stingers in the stingers tab. So stingers are very similar to just if I triggered a sound effect, except they can be beat synced to the grid, the bar, the beat, the custom cues, or any other music parameter. So they're syncable to the beat. That's the benefit of using an actual stinger versus just playing a sound effect. If you don't need any time sync capabilities, it's almost easier to just make them a sound effect and put them in as a sound effect and route them to the appropriate bus, of course, for all sorts of purposes. So I have these hooked up to play immediately. They're not even used yet. These were possible stingers. They didn't end up being used, but that's where you set these up. So let's add a new one just to show you where they are. So they're in the default work unit of trigger. Well, then let's search on stinger. I forget where they are. Drawing a blank. Stinger MX. They are in gang syncs at the bottom. My bad. So this is where they're held. And they're called and they're built into the game. And then when they're triggered via an event, and you actually have to call those specific triggers. When you call the trigger, it will happen on the beat that you've specified in the stinger tab. So I just let those live separate, let them be segments. They're randomized just to prevent them from being boring, and call those triggers whenever you want them to play. So those can be called from events. We'll go ahead and just show you. Trigger, set the trigger, browse, trigger. So that's how you set a trigger. You can call that in the game or in any event. Do whatever you need to do. That's stingers. Transitions, as I said, since this is a bar, this will add a bar of space in between the source music and the transition and the destination. So instead of being butted up together, now there will be a bar in between them where this thing plays. And the old one can fade out and the other one can fade in while it happens, but it still adds a bar. Now I've done some that don't have any. This is intentional. See how the start and the end cue are at the same place? That means there's no actual length in the Wwise system to this. That's weird, right? If I have the source and the destination and then I insert this transition, it doesn't add time. They're still together. The transition occurs over the top. It does the pre-roll while the source is playing, and then the hit happens, and it plays the post-roll while the destination is playing. It's a way to kind of smooth it over without adding any space in between the source and the destination. More just like you added a whole new track in your DAW over something that already occurred without inserting space. This is one way to achieve that. But to use that, you have to make sure in your music settings, transitions, that you do pre-entry and post-exit, because that will play the pre-entry material and the post-exit material that exist in this transition segment. Other note, never, ever, ever check play post-exit. That's generally a horrible thing. It waits till the post-exit to actually do your exit. It's the weirdest thing, and it defaults to it, and it's really, really stupid. I just had to throw that in. Sorry. That's transitions. That's the main music switch. That's how those are set. That's how that's controlled between the two main sub-switches. That's how you map different things to your state changes. That's how you adjust the transitions based on what track it's going to. Now remember, these source and destinations aren't the states themselves. It's what object you've assigned things to in those states. So this only cares about the collectible Shamrock container. If this was called something else in the state, it would be irrelevant. This transition matrix is going to use that playlist container anytime that's playing. If that existed in every single state of here, it would use that because that playlist is playing, not the state. Doesn't really care what state's playing for this transition. It cares what object is playing. It's really important. Weird workflow stuff. Just wanted to cover it because, it's a pain in the butt. And you set the stingers there. So final thing is bus structure. We have a master music bus that has an RTPC to control the volume for the user. This value isn't quite right. We don't really want it at plus 10. We don't want to be able to let them turn it up 10 dB. This is just as it is right now. This is the UI value when you go into the main menu and go, music, I want it more or I want less. That's what this RTPC will control. So the default is 0, and we kind of give it to them at 0, and then if they want to turn it up, we give them a little headroom to do so. This will be adjusted. It's just to show you the RTPC. The SFX Focus duck is a great way to use Wwise Meter to smoothly duck music during big sound effects moments. So we use this heavily on Lucky's Tale 1. For big sound effects that needed focus, especially in VR, you want the music to duck a little bit. You want that perception to drive the mix more than anything. So the SFX Focus duck, I believe, was on a sound effects bus that was, probably on this Focus backup. No, I could find it. It doesn't look like he's using it yet on this game. Let's find out. So if you find all references, that's going to be your best friend for a while. Oh, there you go. SFX Focus Bus. Huh. Where was it? How did I miss that? All right. So the Wwise Meter RTPC, very useful thing. I'm using it in two places. I wanted to cover that real quick. Wwise Meter RTPC. If you take a bus and you add an effect called Wwise Meter allows you to take the signal of a bus and turn it into RTPC values to drive parameters in Wwise. What can you do with that RTPC? Anything. You can control ducking. You can control volumes of a bus. You could control parameters of an EQ. You could control parameters of a compressor. You can control anything RTPCs can control using the volume of a bus. It's pretty badass. So to set it up, it looks like this. I won't go through the actual making a new one because that's, covered elsewhere, but we have a pretty smooth setting here. You'd have to make your new RTPC that holds this output. It looks like this. This is a pretty good starting point of values. You need your min minus 48 and your max 0 because that's what the meters will read, right? When you get almost silence, it will be minus 48 and your RTPC will be, hey, there's no signal on our bus. If you're at 0, it means, hey, we're at 0 dB on our bus. It's super loud and the RTPC will be 0. So then in the output gain parameter in the game sinks, and that's share sets, SFX focus duck, SFX focus duck. In the game parameter, which is in the game parameters, we'll look at what that looks like compared to the actual effect. So this is the effect setting. This is the RTPC gain parameter property editor. You want it to be minus 48 min and the default minus 48 so that when it's silent, it always defaults to silent, meaning the bus has no signal. You never want it to be, outputting volumes. If there's no volumes, you want it to default to silent. And you want the max to be 0 because, well, that just makes sense. Slew rate can be off or on. This smooths values over time. So instead of going like this, slew rate allows you to interpolate between the values, similar to a preamp that has slew rate. It's units per second that it allows it to move. So this slew rate's very, very fast. 74 units per second for only 48 units is going to be negligible. It's just smoothing it out. If I did something like 1, it's going to only allow 1 unit per second to change. So if the bus went boom, it would take 48 seconds to get back to 0 in a very smooth manner, and it would be awful. So it's just a way to kind of smooth over how the values change over time. It's just a way to smooth over these jagged edges. This one worked for me. So this is how you set up the parameters. And then you use that RTPC to do things in your mix. So we'll find all references. Look at that. It's on the SFX. Probably the volume. So the SFX focus bus is ducking this bus when it gets signal very smoothly, not obtrusively. That's what I like about it. You can control your curve perfectly to your settings. So it'll barely turn down. Once it hits 25, it's down at like 2 dB, 1.5 dB. And then if it gets really loud for a moment, it'll duck 7 dB while it's loud. But as it turns down, it'll just go right back to normal. It's a very smooth, sidechain-like effect. Very, very useful. Highly recommended. So I'm using that in a few places. For music, we have another one on the Wwise meter, and it's Stinger duck gameplay music. So some stingers felt like they needed to actually duck the regular gameplay music and have more of an effect that turns down the in-game music and stands out better, but not in a transition way that kills it, in a way that just allows the regular vibe of the level to continue while you play this stinger. So to do so, I put a Wwise meter on it, and as it receives signal, this should look familiar at this point, it's outputting to a new RTPC called MX Stinger Duck Gameplay MX. Oh, that should be minus 48. And Chris just fixed this. You don't want to adjust the values here. You want to adjust them on the targets. Don't adjust these values. This should be that. So let's find that in sync group 1. And this one looks like this. Very similar, except a little faster slew rate, or sorry, little slower slew rate, meaning less units per second allowed. So this outputs when the stinger gets value. When the stinger bus gets value, this RTPC happens. Now it ducks gameplay. So you can go to any RTPC, and in this case, it's the bus volume for the regular in-game music. And as the stinger plays, this RTPC gets values, goes up and says, hey, the stinger's at minus 15. turn down this MX gameplay bus to -13, -14.8. And then as it turns down, it'll go back and return to 0. So this value 0 at -48 is pretty much always what these default to, because when it's silent, you want it to be normal. And when it has signal, you want it to do something. So this, it's a little weird at first when you look at these things, but this is how the Wwise meter works on a general level. So I split out music to be cinematics, gameplay, which is ducked by the stingers. That's what that RTPC is for. The stinger duck, which has the Wwise meter, which is sent to the MX gameplay to do the ducking on the voice volume RTPC. And stinger no duck, which just has stingers that play without doing any ducking. They just play at a normal volume. And that is the music system in a nutshell. That's the bus structure. That's the interactive system. That's where stingers live, transitions live, how they're called, why we use subswitches, and how you map those to the states, and how you can tell where they're mapped. This is where you map your subswitches from the main one, and this is where you'd map your regular switches. So your states point to the correct playlists. That's how you modify your playlists. This is where you set up the mapping of the infinite. That's how you do a first play into a looping track to make it smooth so the loop loops seamlessly and the first play doesn't have to do that. That was how you use custom cues to sync to a particular point, using transitions by defining them in your custom cue filter on your target playlist item. That's how you use transitions in general, some that add length in between the source and the destination, some that don't. That's how you control where it exits on the grid of whatever it says the grid is for that particular track. Or, whoops, I went into the other mode. Up. Backspace. Or how you do it to the beat or immediate. And that basically covers it. So eventually this game will look more like this. It will have children that say MX Sky Castle, and all Sky Castle tracks will live within the Sky Castle. And then there will be a subswitch for each level, similar to this subswitch of main or time trial. It'll say level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And all transitions between levels will then exist here on the music main, going to those. And then the transitions between individual tracks for that level will go here in the subswitch. You can see why that's already more appealing, given you'd only have to manage 6 different transitions in one place for the level. Each level would only have, 6 or 10 transitions instead of one giant list of 500 transitions that good luck navigating this by the end of a project. You're going to go frickin' bonkers. So that's why you want to mix it and add different subswitches per level in the long run. Right now we're, not there yet, but we will be. So that's how it works. Hope that's helpful. That's the Wwise side of things. Now I'm going to dive into the Unity side of things and how we actually call such things and trigger it to play.